Claire stood frozen in the center of her pristine, glass-walled living room, watching a single drop of red wine soak into the white designer rug. Behind her, the rhythmic, heavy sound of Arthur's leather shoes echoed against the polished concrete, stopping just inches from her neck. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and tilted her smartphone screen toward her, showing a live GPS map where a small blue dot was pulsing exactly 3 miles away from where she was supposed to be. The air in the house felt vacuum-sealed, smelling of expensive ozone and a cold, metallic fear. As Arthur's hand tightened on her shoulder, Claire noticed the tiny blue glint of a camera lens hidden inside the smoke detector, its glass eye tracking her every shiver. She realized then that the transparent walls weren't designed for her to look out. They were designed for him to look in. Outside, the Oregon fog swallowed the trees. But inside, there wasn't a single corner left to hide. Claire Whitman opened her eyes as the first needles of sunlight pierced the panoramic windows of the bedroom in Nahalem. The sterile whiteness of the Egyptian cotton sheets felt searingly cold against her skin. Around her stretched a flawless expanse, polished concrete floors reflecting a hollow emptiness and glass walls through which the Oregon woods stood silent. Claire ran her palm over the smooth surface of the designer nightstand, finding not a single speck of dust. The air in the house smelled of expensive ozone and indifference. She felt the ringing silence of the cavernous rooms press against her eardrums. Every piece of furniture sat at a calculated angle, turning the living space into a frigid museum exhibit where Claire was merely another voiceless artifact. At breakfast, Arthur Whitman pushed away his plate of untouched omelet and reached for Claire's smartphone. His fingers flitted across the screen, illuminating his face with a deathly blue light. Arthur turned the display toward Claire, pointing at a message from her sister. His lips compressed into a thin line while he waited for a response. Claire gripped her fork so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Arthur demanded a minute-by-minute account of yesterday's correspondence, boring his gaze into Claire's eyes. The tea in her cup grew cold, forming a thin film on the surface, while Arthur read every word aloud in a mocking, nasally imitation of her sister's voice. Claire stood at the supermarket checkout, watching the scrolling text on the card terminal. The cashier swiped Claire's card for the 3rd time, but a crimson rectangle popped up on the screen with the word "declined." Claire felt heat flood her neck and cheeks under the stares of the waiting line. The basket held only basic groceries and a bottle of children's vitamins. But Arthur had set a limit that had apparently been exhausted on a gallon of milk. Claire frantically checked the banking app on her phone, seeing the restriction Arthur had placed on any spending over $10. She left the bags on the belt and walked quickly to the parking lot, inhaling the sharp, salty air to steady her breathing. The moment Claire crossed the threshold of the foyer, Arthur's shadow fell across the oak floor. He stood with arms crossed, staring at his wristwatch and pointedly tapping the dial with one finger. Claire froze with her keys in hand, hearing Arthur's heavy, rhythmic breathing. He took a step forward, closing the distance until she smelled his minty cologne. Arthur towered over her, forcing her back against the cold front door. 5 minutes of lateness transformed into a quiet, furious lecture that made Claire's knees tremble beneath the hem of her dress. Later, Claire dropped to her knees on the dirty asphalt of the garage, peering under the rear bumper of the SUV. Her fingers brushed against a foreign object attached to the frame by a powerful magnet. She yanked away a small black box with a blinking green LED. On the plastic casing, she saw the faint whirls of Arthur's fingerprints. Claire turned the GPS tracker over in her hands, realizing every turn of the wheel and every stop had been logged in Arthur's app. The metal of the device felt glacial. She pressed the find to her chest, hearing her heart hammer against her ribs, while in the silence of the garage, The distant sound of Arthur's footsteps echoed from the stairs above. Claire squared her shoulders and entered Arthur's office, clutching the invitation to the Nahalem City Charity Gala. Her voice sounded uncharacteristically bright as she described meeting old friends and the music that would fill the hall. She gestured broadly, speaking of the chance to finally step beyond the boundaries of their estate. For a fleeting moment, a spark of her former life, one untouched by Arthur's hand, flickered in her eyes. Claire smiled, looking at him, waiting for even a shadow of approval. Arthur slowly laid down his pen and lifted his head, studying her animated face with the heavy, unblinking stare of a predator. Arthur rose slowly from behind the desk, and the smile died on Claire's face. His voice sounded like the crack of breaking ice as he spoke of her instability. He began to list imaginary symptoms of depression and anxiety that supposedly made Claire's public appearance impossible. She tried to object, but Arthur cut her off in a soft, relentless tone, convincing her of her own fragility. He walked to the window, declaring that caring for her mental health was his primary priority. Claire felt the walls of the office contract, his argument stripping away her right to define her own reality. Claire fled into the bathroom and turned the latch until it clicked shut. She twisted the faucet to full power so the roar of the water would drown her sobs. In the mirror, she saw a pale face with reddened eyes. Behind the door, the muffled voices of Emily and Benjamin drifted through, and Claire bit her lip to keep from screaming in frustration. She slid down the tiled wall to the floor, wrapping her arms around her shoulders. Every object in this room, from the gilded taps to the plush towels, reminded her of her total dependence on Arthur's will. She realized she had no money, no keys, and no voice. Arthur threw open Claire's closet and pulled out a silk evening gown of deep emerald. Claire watched from the doorway as he carried the fabric to the kitchen trash bin. He bunched the delicate silk in his fist and shoved it down on top of coffee grounds and vegetable peelings. Claire let out a small cry, but Arthur merely adjusted his shirt cuffs. He stated that since she wasn't attending the gala, she no longer had a use for the dress. Claire stared at the stained hem, realizing Arthur was destroying more than just clothing. He was incinerating her ability to choose or experience pleasure. Claire pressed her forehead against the cold glass in the living room, watching the gray fog roll over the Nahalem coast. The glass panels Arthur took such pride in no longer seemed like symbols of freedom or openness. In the reflection, she saw her own features trapped within a transparent cube. Outside, the world looked blurred and unattainable, as if she were at the bottom of a deep aquarium. She traced a finger along the invisible barrier separating her from the trees. The glass walls of the house had become a monolithic cage. Arthur's reflection appeared in the glass behind her, a reminder of the constant surveillance within the cell. A sharp crash of a breaking plate echoed from the dining room, and Claire saw the children instantly tuck their heads into their shoulders. Arthur stood over the shards, his face twisted in a grimace of rage directed at Benjamin. Claire noticed the children's hands shaking, their eyes darting away to avoid Arthur's gaze. In Emily's eyes, Claire read the same paralyzing terror that gripped her own heart. Claire stepped toward them, shielding them with her body from Arthur's heavy breathing. The realization pierced her. Arthur's fury was no longer limited to words, and a physical threat now hung over every member of the household. Claire sat in the darkness of the kitchen while Arthur slept upstairs. She closed her eyes and began to mentally map the house, noting the positions of the security cameras and motion sensors. She recalled the schedule of Arthur's rounds and the exact time he usually left the car keys on the console. Her fingers gripped the edge of the marble island as she plotted. Claire squeezed the cold body of a flash drive in her pocket as she sat at a massive oak desk in the far corner of the Portland Library's reading room. The scent of old paper and floor wax usually calmed her, but Claire's fingers trembled as she slid the device into the library computer's port. On the screen, endless columns of figures and Arthur's offshore accounts flickered into view. She partially obscured the monitor with an open book of Monet reproductions, faking a deep immersion in Impressionism. The cursor hovered over the upload button. Claire heard only the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the dry rustle of pages, while the progress bar crawled to the right, transferring Arthur's financial sins into a secret digital vault. A shadow fell across the keyboard, and Claire slammed the art book shut. Arthur stood behind her, his heavy palm dropping onto her shoulder, pinching the collarbone. He placed a velvet case on the table. Inside, a necklace of cold platinum bit into the padding. Arthur didn't take his eyes off Claire's face, while his free hand moved to the mouse. Claire held her breath, watching as Arthur methodically opened the browser history. The glittering stones around her neck felt like a noose. Arthur slowly scrolled through the list of harmless queries about art, but his gaze remained sharp and suspicious, as if he were trying to catch the scent of her fear. Upon returning home, Claire stood on her tiptoes in the living room, peering into the grate of a smoke detector. Between the plastic ribs, she caught the faint blue glint of a glass lens. Her heart skipped a beat. She moved through the house, discovering the same dead pupils of hidden cameras in the ceiling moldings above the bed and in the corner of the kitchen. Claire felt as though invisible threads of surveillance were winding around her body. Every gesture she made now felt unnatural under the aim of Arthur's hidden lenses. The walls of the house no longer offered shelter. They had become Arthur's compound eyes, recording every blink and every ragged breath. Arthur tossed Claire's plastic debit card, sliced in half, onto the kitchen island. She stared at the glossy fragments, knowing her last link to the outside world was severed. Arthur unlocked his smartphone and showed Claire a new app for controlling family finances. Now, even to pay for school lunches, Claire had to wait for Arthur to deign to send her a temporary access code. A spasm of humiliation tightened her throat. Arthur tapped the screen mockingly, explaining that this measure would protect her from impulsive spending. Claire saw her reflection in the black glass of Arthur's phone. A woman stripped of the right to even a cup of coffee without permission. Claire knelt on the floor of the nursery, surrounded by worn volumes of fairy tales. She carefully peeled back the end paper of an old book about Peter Pan, hiding her printed bank statements inside the gap. The glue smelled sharp and chemical. She smoothed the paper, making sure not to leave a single crease. These pages were her only weapon. Tomorrow, Claire had to pass this book to Sophia at the library, hoping Arthur wouldn't notice the extra weight in Benjamin's backpack. Claire pressed the book to her chest, hearing Arthur's footsteps in the hallway, and quickly shoved the evidence deep into the shelf among the colorful spines. Claire reached for the front door handle, but Arthur blocked her path, leaning his hand against the frame. Beside him stood a tall man in a gray suit with an impenetrable expression. Arthur announced that this was Marcus, Claire's personal driver. Cold sweat trickled down Claire's spine. Arthur adjusted the collar of her coat, speaking of her fragile mental state requiring constant supervision. Now, Claire wouldn't be able to take a step without a shadow behind her. Marcus silently opened the rear door of the car, and Claire realized the vehicle was a mobile cell from which Arthur would monitor every route. Claire locked herself in the bathroom and frantically dialed the lawyer's number. In the receiver, instead of a dial tone, there was only a monotonous, white noise. She held the phone higher, searching for a signal, but the bars on the screen remained empty. On the shelf under the sink, Claire spotted a new metal box with blinking red lights, a signal jammer. Arthur had robbed her of her voice. Claire pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. The hum of the device felt like Arthur's triumphant laughter. In this sterile space, she was now completely cut off, trapped in the radio silence Arthur had installed for her peace of mind. Claire yanked the handle of the bedroom door, but the lock answered with a dry metallic click. Arthur stood on the other side, his voice muffled by the wood, sounding frighteningly caring. He explained that he had called a doctor specializing in nervous breakdowns, and until he arrived, it was best for Claire to stay in bed. Claire hammered her fists against the oak panel, but Arthur simply turned up the volume of the classical music playing in the hall. The room became a gilded cage. Claire paced from the window to the door, feeling Arthur's trap snap shut. Below, the sound of an approaching car echoed, and Claire realized Arthur had moved to the final stage of her isolation. Claire noticed the figure of Sophia through the window, coming to pick up the promised books. Arthur was on the terrace below, animatedly arguing with someone on the phone. Claire grabbed the bundle of documents and cautiously cracked open the window. The hinges creaked treacherously, and Claire froze, staring at the back of Arthur's head. A second felt like an eternity. She released the bundle, and it fell silently into her colleague's hands on the lawn. Sophia quickly disappeared behind the bushes. Claire closed the window and slid to the floor, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. Arthur continued laughing on the terrace, unaware that Claire had just smuggled the truth beyond his borders. Arthur entered the bedroom, carrying a tray with a fragrant stew. Claire backed into the corner of the bed, staring at the sheet of paper lying next to the plate. Arthur began to read aloud the text of a statement for Claire's voluntary commitment due to incapacity. Every word was a hammer blow. He described hallucinations and flashes of aggression she had never experienced. Steam from the food rose to the ceiling, mixing with the scent of her fear. Arthur held out a pen, his fingers touching her palm, a contact that felt like a burn. He whispered that her signature was the only way to keep the family together. When Arthur left, Claire opened her nightstand drawer and found a blister pack with no name. Next to it stood the cup of tea Arthur had insisted she drink. Claire crushed one pill between her fingers. It turned into a fine white powder, odorless and tasteless. Arthur planned to turn her into an obedient shadow before the lawyers arrived. Claire poured the tea into the pot of an orchid, watching Arthur's poison soak into the dirt. Her muscles were tense. She had to mimic weakness and mental fog so Arthur would believe in the success of his plan. She lay back on the pillows, closing her eyes and waiting for the sound of his footsteps. Claire pressed her ear to the door, catching fragments of Arthur's conversation. Claire stood before the mirror in the dressing room, where the scent of fresh perfume mingled with the aroma of old leather. The fabric of the midnight blue dress rustled under her fingers. She carefully slid the tiny black chassis of a voice recorder under the stiff lace of the waistband. The metal of the device bit into her skin with a chill, making her flinch. She smoothed the folds, checking that the device didn't bulge through the thin silk. In the reflection, Claire saw her dilated pupils and the pale line of her lips. Every stitch at her waist felt like armor, concealing her only hope for the truth. She took a deep breath, feeling the corset squeeze her ribs. Arthur burst into the room, the slam of the door echoing in Claire's ears. He threw a sheet of paper covered in red marker streaks onto the white bedspread. Claire saw her own words about the dissolution of the marriage, crossed out in Arthur's toxic red ink. Every underlying demand for property division looked like a bleeding wound. Arthur loomed over her, and she felt the heat radiating from his body. Claire retreated until her calves hit the edge of the bed. The paper beneath Arthur's hand crunched into a shapeless ball as she watched the pulsing vein at his temple. Arthur's fingers roughly caught the platinum chain around Claire's neck. She heard the dry snap of the clasp, and the heavy necklace fell to the carpet like a dead snake. Arthur spat out words, looking directly into her eyes, and informed her of the imminent arrival of a vehicle from the Quiet Shores Clinic. Claire felt the skin on her neck burn from the sharp jerk. Images of white corridors and locked wards flooded her mind. Arthur pointedly adjusted his watch, counting down the last minutes of her freedom. Claire touched the empty space on her collarbones, feeling only a sticky terror as Arthur smugly surveyed the fruits of his power. Claire lunged for the exit, but Arthur intercepted her halfway. His strong fingers bit into her wrist, leaving purple marks on her pale skin. She felt a sharp shove, and her back met the soft surface of the mattress. Arthur loomed in the doorway, blocking the path to escape with his broad shoulders. Claire watched as he turned the key in the lock, the sound feeling like a final sentence. Arthur breathed heavily, his shadow covering her, robbing her of the sunlight. Claire gripped the bedspread in her fists, watching as he methodically drew the curtains, plunging the room into artificial twilight. Arthur held a tablet inches from Claire's face. On the flickering screen, she saw grainy footage. Sophia handing a bundle to a man in a gray cap. Claire recognized the familiar wrapping, but her hope crumbled when the stranger on the video turned and nodded toward the camera. Arthur chuckled, swiping the image away. Claire realized Arthur's private investigator had played the role of an ally from the start. The bluish light of the screen highlighted the lines around Arthur's eyes. She felt nauseous watching him delete the file that was supposed to be her ticket to freedom with a single swipe. Arthur pulled Claire's passport from his jacket pocket. She saw her photo on the spread before his fingers tore into the paper. The first rip sounded like a gunshot. He methodically shredded the thick pages, and small scraps, like confetti, showered over Claire's shoes. She watched her identity turn into a heap of trash under his feet. Arthur held the cover up to her face, showing the destroyed emblem. The air in the room felt too thick. Claire watched him grind the remains of her document into the carpet with the sole of his shoe, erasing the last traces of her legal existence. Arthur pushed Claire toward the stairs leading to the glittering lights of the living room. She felt the sharp edge of his gold tie clip press against her ribs through the thin dress fabric. He draped an arm over her shoulder, creating the illusion of tender support. Claire was forced to smile at the guests, while the cold metal in Arthur's hand threatened to pierce her skin at any wrong move. The noise of social chatter and the clink of crystal felt surreal. Arthur whispered compliments in her ear, digging his fingers into her shoulder so hard she could barely suppress a groan of pain in front of the photographers. Among the sparkling dresses, Claire noticed the familiar profile of a journalist from the local paper. She tried to lean forward, but Arthur's steel grip on her waist instantly tightened. He leaned in close, his hot breath burning her earlobe. Arthur spoke the names of her children, promising that one wrong gesture would mean she'd never hear their voices again. Claire froze, feeling an icy chill spread through her limbs. The journalist raised a glass, looking her way, but she lowered her eyes, studying the bubbles in her champagne. Arthur victoriously squeezed her elbow, leading her away from the dangerous acquaintance. Arthur led Claire onto the terrace, where the night air smelled of salt and pine. Through the thick branches of the hedges, she saw the rhythmic flashes of blue and red lights on the driveway. A white van with no markings stood with its engine idling, and she heard its muffled thrum. Arthur held her firmly by the elbow, directing her toward the dark steps. Claire dug her heels into the stone tiles, but he pulled her relentlessly. The shadow of the house hid Arthur's face, turning him into a faceless executioner. Claire saw the rear doors of the van slowly swing open, revealing a sterile void ready to swallow her. An image of a plush bear with a torn ear, tossed on the living room sofa, flashed in Claire's mind. She remembered sewing the second flash drive into the stuffing while Arthur was in the shower. That small detail, data on Arthur's fraudulent bankruptcies, still lay there amidst the party noise. She frantically searched for the yellow fur through the panoramic window. Arthur pushed her further into the shadows, but she caught the bright spot of the toy on the carpet. She felt a spark of desperate resolve. Arthur didn't know about the cash, and Claire realized that Bear was her only chance to survive the night. Arthur pressed Claire's back against the glass parapet, and she heard the waves crashing against the rocks below. He squeezed her throat with his palm, demanding the names of the accomplices who received copies of the reports. Claire saw madness and a thirst for retribution in his eyes. The glass behind her vibrated with the wind. It seemed ready to shatter under the weight of their bodies. Arthur shook her, trying to beat a confession out of her, his face contorted in a grimace of rage. Claire snapped her chin up, intercepting Arthur's wrist. Her fingers closed over his pulsing vein with unexpected strength. She leaned into his face until their breaths mingled. Her voice sounded like metal scraping glass when she spoke of a dead man's switch in the cloud storage. She informed him that a countdown timer had already been triggered. If she didn't enter a security code by midnight, folders containing Arthur's double-entry bookkeeping would fly into the inboxes of his major shareholders. Her eyes remained motionless and cold while Arthur slowly loosened his grip on her throat. Taking advantage of Arthur's momentary confusion, Claire took a sharp step back. She reached into the folds of her lace waistband and pulled out the miniature device. She pressed the play button, and the terrace was filled with Arthur's distorted but distinct roar, threatening to lock her in a psychiatric ward. The recorder's speaker rattled with Arthur's furious admissions of forging medical reports. Claire held the device before her like a loaded gun. Arthur moved toward her, but she raised a finger, pointing to the microphone. Arthur's face broke out in uneven red splotches as she watched his impotent malice. Claire turned and resolutely pushed the glass door leading into the glowing living room. She burst into the circle of light, where the air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted nuts. She squared her shoulders, feeling Arthur's heavy breath behind her as he followed. Claire wedged herself into a group of guests discussing the yachting season and flashed a dazzling smile. Arthur was forced to freeze 2 steps away, stretching his lips into the fake snarl of a respectable host. Claire took a glass from a tray, the thin crystal clinking slightly against her teeth. She bathed in the crowd's attention, using the gazes of others as a living shield that kept Arthur from even touching her hand. Claire headed for the leather sofa where, among the discarded silk pillows, the worn plush bear lay. She grabbed the toy by its paw, feeling the hard lump inside the stuffing. Arthur stepped toward her, his eyes widening in realization. With a sudden movement, Claire ripped the seam on the bear's belly, and a cloud of white batting scattered over the rug. She plunged her fingers into the toy's depths and fished out the silver casing of the flash drive. Arthur froze, his fingers convulsively clutching an empty glass. Claire held the trophy high above her head so the chandelier light caught the glint of the metal. Arthur took a deep, whistling breath, realizing the scale of his miscalculation. Arthur tried to cut off Claire's path to the oak doors of the hall, looming over her with his massive frame. Claire did not retreat. Instead, she stepped into the center of the room. She loudly called out the name of Mr. Banks, the journalist standing by the buffet table. Her voice cut through the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation, forcing the guests' heads to turn. Claire pointed at Arthur, declaring his desire to discuss certain discrepancies in their family archive. Arthur froze, his hand reaching for her shoulder, dropping uselessly. A ringing silence fell, broken only by the click of someone's camera shutter. Claire gave a short nod to Sophia, who was standing in the shadow of the doorway with an open laptop. The woman hit a key, And at that same moment, the silence of the living room exploded into a cacophony of sound. The pockets of businessmen's jackets and the handbags of their wives began to vibrate and emit notification pings. Claire watched as the investors, one by one, pulled out their smartphones, their faces lengthening in astonishment. The blue light of the screens illuminated spreadsheets of Arthur's offshore transfers. Claire saw Arthur frantically fumbling in his own pockets, but his phone remained silent. The digital stream of truth Claire had initiated turned the gala into an open-air courtroom in seconds. Arthur turned a grayish pale, watching his closest partners recoil from him as if from a leper. Claire felt Arthur's fingers, which had held her elbow in a death grip, slide helplessly away. He tried to say something, but his voice broke into a rasp. She saw the invisible throne fall. Arthur's face looked haggard and old in the merciless light of hundreds of lamps. Claire took a free step to the side, leaving him to stand alone in the middle of the rug. Now, Arthur was just a target for the contemptuous stares of people he had considered his subordinates only that morning. Claire flew up the stairs, taking them two at a time. In the nursery, she yanked the sleepy children up, throwing jackets over their shoulders. She didn't waste time on suitcases. She grabbed only the backpack with the documents. From below came Arthur's furious shouts and the sound of chairs being shoved back. Investors were demanding explanations. Claire led the children through the narrow corridor to the servants' back exit. The cold metal of the door handle gave way without resistance. She pushed the children into the darkness of the backyard, hearing something fall with a crash inside the house. She didn't look back, feeling the night air fill her lungs with the scent of freedom and wet grass. Claire threw open the door of the old sedan where Sophia sat behind the wheel. The engine was already running, filling the air with blue smoke. Claire buckled the children in and fell into the front seat herself. She ordered the driver to head for the county police station. In the light of the cabin lamp, Claire examined her wrists. The purple fingerprints of Arthur's grip stood out clearly on her skin. She pulled out her phone and took several photos of the hematomas while the car bounced over potholes. Every turn of the wheels distanced her from the glass house in Nehalem. She clenched her fists, feeling fear being displaced by a cold determination to see the matter through. Claire stepped onto the gravel path in front of the state courthouse, squinting against the bright northern sun. In her hands was a folder with an embossed seal and a sole custody order. She ran a finger over the line of the restraining order that forbade Arthur from coming within a mile of her. The wind whipped the hem of her light dress, but she no longer flinched at sharp sounds. The children ran ahead to the parked car, laughing and pushing each other. Claire looked at her signature at the bottom of the document. It was clear and firm, without a single sign of a tremor. She got behind the wheel of her own car, choosing her own direction for the first time in 10 years. Claire stood at the edge of the surf, where cold foam licked the soles of her bare feet. The children nearby were focused on building a fortress of wet sand, decorating it with shell fragments. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket and saw a notification from Arthur's lawyers with an offer for a pre-trial settlement. Claire slowly pressed the delete button, watching the message dissolve into the digital void. The sound of the ocean drowned out all her other thoughts. She saw seagulls diving into the waves, a movement that seemed the embodiment of absolute will. She put the phone back in her bag, knowing that not another word of Arthur's would ever reach her ears.